We are a family of 3, therefore our grocery expenses are substantial. The children, who are 10, 7, and 3, are being raised by me at home while my spouse works at a software business. At least twice a week, I go grocery shopping. I typically visit the King Colony neighborhood near our home, but I also occasionally visit the adjacent Target. In our sleepy hamlet, there are very few grocery stores, those 2 being the only ones. In order to provide as much background as possible, my family is Italian, and I am 40 years old. I was 39 years old when this happened, not even a year ago. One day, I went shopping considerably later than normal as I was running behind schedule. I ran over to the store with my flyers and coupons because the King Colony shuts at 10, and it was clearly beyond 9. I had to make a fast trip to the grocery store because the kids were whining about not having enough food in the house. Most days, my husband was home from work at this point, so I had to go shopping with my 3-year-old daughter Haley. I consider it a pleasure that I was able to go shopping by myself for once. When I arrived at the King Colony, which was about to close, there weren't many people there. After taking a cart, I hurriedly began making my way through the aisles, picking up everything on my list, plus anything that was discounted. I was astonished to feel a tap on my shoulder while I was in the cereal aisle. Turning, I saw an extremely brown man about my height wearing jeans, a red zipper-up sweatshirt, and a black OT with a baseball cap on. After apologizing for surprising me, he stated he had been searching everywhere for a certain bag of chips that I had in my cart and inquired where I had located them. He then left. When I kindly pointed out the aisle to him, he replied he had looked but couldn't locate it. In fact, I showed him exactly where I had hidden the chips. With a horrible breath, he thanked me, and I smiled, ready to head back to my cart. However, he soon began blathering on and on with me about why he thought those chips were so great. Something absurd like the components or the absence of a particular ingredient, for example. I was slowly making my way back to my cart, and I was trying to make it evident. Even so, he would miss the hint. I thanked him and had to go back to my shopping before they closed when he paused strangely and remarked, "Gosh, you're pretty." He followed me to my cart, but he didn't stop chatting to me. I told him that I really would just like to shop in peace at this time, with all the grace I could muster. Eventually, he appeared to understand and left, but not before spending the remainder of the evening in the store. Every time he passed an aisle, I saw the man walking around them in circles. He would slow down or maybe stop and simply stare down at me while I was in. I raced through my shopping since I was becoming more and more uncomfortable. When I was at last finished, I emptied my cart at the register. This red-hooded man arrives with 2 or 3 items and waits online directly behind me. He doesn't say anything anymore, but I could still feel his stare through the back of my mind. My checkout was complete. As I was unloading my car, I shoved my cart aside and ignored the man's "good night, ma'am" greeting. As he made his way to his car in the parking lot, I noticed the red hoodie guy staring at me. He climbed into what must have been a 30-year-old Honda, which looked like garbage. He only sat in the car without turning it on. When I was finally done loading my car, I got in, turned on my engine, and drove out of the parking lot. I felt safe enough to drive home after a few quick glances in my rearview mirror and the absence of any headlights behind me. I didn't know where there was a car with its headlights off slowly approaching our house until I pulled into the driveway and glanced to my left down the street. A few homes down, he stopped to the curb, appearing to be that Honda from the parking lot. I entered the house and yelled for my spouse. He looked worried when he got downstairs, so I told him that a creep was following me home. The automobile had already left by the time he rushed outside to the porch. We were all in bed late the next weekend when we heard some rummaging around outside in the side yard. My spouse went to inspect what it was after I gave him a shake, and he opened the window. He heard the window slide open and observed someone trying to open the side gate to the backyard just below the window. The man looked up and began to run. When my husband returned a minute later, he said he saw the car rushing down the street and tried to follow after it, which perfectly resembled the shabby Honda that the red-haired guy was driving. My husband had taken the baseball bat from beneath the bed and run outside. Clearly, that was him. Despite the late hour, a police officer showed up at our house in less than 5 minutes after we contacted the police. The best way I could characterize the man and his car was that he never came back to our house, not after he witnessed my husband, in a fit of rage, chase his car on foot with a bat. The fact that such a predator knows where I live still bothers me. You poor people would constantly be forced to work that terrible shift, because the one I worked at was a 24-hour operation. My manager has my school schedule, so I informed her I was off on Mondays and Wednesdays, so I think she viewed me as the ideal candidate to stick on the midnight shift. I had assumed that since I was 20 and in college, my boss would never put me on an overnight shift. Every now and again going ahead, I noticed one day that I had a Tuesday night appointment from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. To be sure that was correct, I had to check the schedule 3 times. When I questioned my supervisor why I had been assigned to the overnight shift, I felt ill to my stomach. He told me that I really didn't have an option if I was over 18, but I needed the work and the money, so I thought about quitting. I decided to inform my supervisor that I couldn't do it again after giving it my all and doing it just once. I arrived at the store at 12 o'clock since I had to study for school, and I relieved my coworker Amanda as half of the lights were down at this time to conserve electricity. When I arrived, there was an unexpectedly large number of people in the store. I assumed more people than I thought would make hasty nighttime shopping trips after 1 in the morning. As the night wore on, the establishment was deserted, with only 3 patrons over the whole hour. By 2 a.m., there were fewer and fewer patrons. It had been over an hour since there had been a customer, and by now, I was as bored as it was possible to be. I questioned whether the building included any additional staff members. I reasoned that they couldn't have a single 20-year-old managing the entire operation by himself. Every few minutes, a bald man who appeared to be a manager would frequently walk by the front registers. He was carrying a tiny backpack-style bag in his hand and had a key ring with about 10 keys tied to his khakis. After I remarked, "Excuse me, are you the manager?" he approached me and inquired about my first day of work. I replied that it was my first night shift. Without mentioning his name, he shook my hand and asked if I could sort the pallets in the store's back warehouse. Watching the front, he said, "That wasn't really clear to me, but I was sure I would understand." As I moved to the back of the shop, I noticed him working on the front door of the establishment. It appeared as though he was trying to lock it by reaching for a switch on the side of it. As I entered the back warehouse, I noticed a tall man who appeared to be in his 30s wearing a vest with the words "Wall Bounce" on it. Identifying himself as Rob, the night manager, he pointed to my apron. He looked perplexed and asked, "Who?" When I answered, "Oh, I thought the guy in the front was the night manager," he demanded to see the individual I was referring to when I identified him as the one from previously, as the only manager on duty was him. Before we knew it, every light in the store had gone out in the warehouse. Rob asked me to wait in the warehouse while he investigated the situation. I watched as he entered the store through the warehouse doors and into the complete darkness, with the sole source of light coming from the dairy coolers still on lights. I tried texting any pals who might have been awake about what was going on while sitting on a box on the pallet. The freezer and dairy fridge were on the opposite side of the warehouse when I heard a door open from within. There were 2 routes from the warehouse back into the retail space. I stayed there for a little longer, listening for any noises with my ears perked up. A voice said, "Hey kid, you in here?" But it wasn't Rob's voice. It was that bald guy's. As I heard slow, silent footsteps approach, I ran through the warehouse doors and into the store, but I didn't see Rob as I jogged to the front of the establishment in silence. I tried to open the exit door by calling his name, but it didn't open on its own. I then grabbed my jacket. I attempted to unlock it physically, but it was locked. I nearly screamed when I heard footsteps coming from behind me. But then I saw it was Rob, the manager. He unlocked the door by flipping a lever or something else on top right, and then he whispered in a frenzy to hurry and get out. He trailed me in the rear. After we left the business, he immediately called the police, and I overheard their entire exchange. He declared that he thought an armed individual had locked himself into the Waldos and was most likely attempting to loot the establishment. I suspected he was going to hurt me at the warehouse, so I told him to report it to the police. He informed the operator of this, telling me to either go wait in my car or get out. He probably did this to avoid having the store accountable for anything. In the event that something happened, I went to sit in my car and observe for a little period. Within 10 minutes, at least 4 police cars had pulled up outside the business. For a while, they all walked inside, and I was blind to what was happening. I left, but I didn't leave. Instead, my supervisor informed me everything that had transpired when I returned to work the following day. The security camera captured the bald man suspiciously circling the area and making sure it was safe to proceed, whatever he had planned to do once the doors were locked. The most terrifying thing to me was when he turned out the lights in the store, and the cameras showed him walking straight to the warehouse where he had instructed me to go. Because the camera showed him departing by the warehouse's emergency escape before the cops eventually turned up, if he had been armed and robbing the facility, he might have been on his way to put a gun to my head or whatever. After speaking with my manager, I never worked an overnight shift again, and I continued working at that position for a few more months. That man may or may not have been identified. In a rather rural area, I used to work as a night restocked at a supermarket. It was the biggest and best supermarket in the area, and it was named Great American. My shift would start at 10 a.m. when the store closed. Before the next working day, I would reload the shelves and organize everything, working from 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. at the latest. Naturally, I had the store's keys for after-hours access. Tonight, my team would consist of 2 members, Terry Carter or Alfonso. Terry and I were meant to be working together. When I got to the store, I was able to enter the rear where all of the stuff that hadn't been stocked for us was. I set out to use the pallet for my work, jacked to carry a full pallet of boxes to the store area. I began by moving the older loaves to the front and the younger loaves to the rear midway across the bread and nut aisle. It dawned on me that I hadn't seen Terry yet. I make my way to the store's rear, where the inventory was kept, where our possessions are left. He had not returned there yet. I gave him a door stopper and kept the back door slightly ajar. When he would arrive, so I returned to my job and waited another 30 minutes for Terry to appear. I proceeded to the back of the shop once more. I saw that the back door was closed, but he wasn't inside. That implied to me that Terry was somewhere about here. I considered it strange that the door stopper was outside when I tried to open the back door. Rather than taking it inside, he kicked it outside. Terry didn't return my call, but I could hear his name resounding around the room. I decided to give him a call, and when I inquired if he was at work, he claimed he wasn't going in tonight because he had unexpectedly been ill. He sounded like he was in bed. He replied it might have easily come undone by itself when I informed him someone had kicked the door stopper off the door. This gave me the chills. That night was the only one with a scheduled shift. We hung up after I told him to feel better. I kicked the door stopper under the door fairly firmly, so I wasn't sure whether I was satisfied that it came undone on its own. After making sure nobody was in the back of the store, I quickly glanced around before returning to my work. Though I was a little uncomfortable the entire time, I heard a loud sound echoing from across the retail floor as I was restocking the remaining bread. Well, someone had to enter here now. I rose from my kneeling position and proceeded to the central aisle, which connected to every other aisle. I turned to face the aisle and stood there for a few moments when a man in black strolled past the center aisle and glanced down at me from the dairy section on the other side of the store. My heart began to sink. It reminded me of the scene in the movie Signs where the extraterrestrial passes by the birthday celebration. I had to use common sense and consider the possibility that our supervisor had not informed me that someone else was covering for Terry's shift. I started to hurry down the middle aisle while loudly yelling, "Excuse me." I scanned every aisle to the left. He moved through one of those aisles and toward the front of the store, so I went by. At the conclusion of it, he was standing there, totally facing my direction, waiting. He turned to face me and walked away from me. "Excuse me," I cried out once more and began sprinting down that aisle to catch up to him. I haven't had a chance to see his face clearly yet. Upon reaching the head of the aisle near the cash registers, I followed his path and noticed him all the way to the end by the bread aisle, where half of his body was concealed by the shelf. He began to wave me over with his jaw hanging open, but he said nothing. I was freaking out over his face. I tried to talk to him again, asking who he was, but he slipped out of sight behind the shelf. For this, I wasn't getting paid enough. I went outside and got into my car to give my boss a call. When he came to pick me up, I informed him about the weird freight that was wandering the store. He instructed me to either phone the police or try to get him out of there. I dialed 911 because I was not going to try to take a mad individual out of the store by force. I waited in my vehicle for a police vehicle to arrive. I said hello to the policeman and asked him to come inside with me. As we searched the area for the man, we noticed him eerily standing in one of the aisles once more, seemingly engaged in a game. He was the oddest man, and when the policeman told him to come here, he really did listen. He was also handcuffed. He kept licking his lips and smiled at me, more than I had ever seen. Huge bags were under his eyes. When the policeman answered and said he was searching for a snack, it was the only thing he said. The way he was staring at me worried me. He was being led back outside to his car by the policeman. I still remember this frightening, sinister smile to this day. Needless to say, I never again left any of the doors open as I carried on with my work.